Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rowan Pence, Executive Director at the Australian Chamber of Commerce in South Korea. Welcome to our first beverage industry panel discussion for 2021, the evolution of Korea's beer and liquor industry, challenges and opportunities. Bringing together several industry experts, today's fireside chat will discuss and explore recent evolution of Korea's alcohol beverage market, the impact of COVID-19, and insights and perspectives of the future of Korea's beer and liquor industry. In exploring this topic, we are joined by Matthew Holmes, AE Brands General Manager, Ross Gregory, Moonbear Founder, Julian Mellor, the Sool Company Founder, Dan Hamilton, Managing Director of Diageo Korea. And finally, our moderator, we have Jacco Zwetsloot. As you can see today, we're filming in the Grand Hyatt's Paris Bar, who have kindly sponsored today's event. For those who are not familiar with the venue, the Grand Hyatt Seoul is located in the heart of the nation's capital, situated amongst the beauty of Mount Namsan. The Paris Bar is a European classic bar with a similar atmosphere of a gentleman's club, famous for its live pianist and a relaxed yet professional service. Now, to begin the session, I'm going to hand it over to Jacco, who will introduce our panelists a little bit further. Thank you, Jacco.
Hello, thanks to Rowan and thanks to Australian Chamber of Commerce for having me here today, and thanks to our guests for coming, and also to our live audience watching over the Zoom, and also to a futuristic hello to our future audience who'll be watching the recorded version on YouTube at some stage. So hi to everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Jacco Zwetsloot. I am the host of a weekly podcast about North Korea called the NK News Podcast, and I also work for a PR firm called Insight Communications. That's me out of the way. I'm now going to ask our four expert panelists to introduce themselves a little bit and what they do in the alcoholic beverage industry. First, I'd like to turn to Matthew Holmes of AE Brands Korea. Matthew, take it away.
Thanks, Jacco, and good afternoon, everyone. Quick intro, Matthew Holmes. I'm a very proud product of the Australia-Korea internship programs. First coming to Korea in 2000 as an intern with our very good business partner, POSCO. That's where I've learned to love Korea. I've developed some lifetime friendships. After that, I was with KPMG for about 11 years. And then I've moved to Asahi Europe and International, which is the international business of the Asahi Group. I think currently we're the third largest beer producer in the world. We recently acquired Carlton United Breweries in Australia. So you'll be familiar with many of our brands in the CUB portfolio, but we also do much loved brands in Europe: Peroni, Grolsch, Pilsner Urquell, and Kozel. Over to you, Jacco.
Thanks, and now to Ross Gregory of Moonbear Brewing and also Indulge. Tell us, Ross, about yourself and your companies.
Thanks, Jacco. Good morning, everyone. I've been in Korea for about 17 years, a similar length to Matthew. Most of that time has been spent in banking, but I was a passive investor in a liquor importer over the last 10 years, which imports in particular a sparkling grape from South Africa called Bernini, which you'll find all around the country, and a number of spirits. 3 years ago, I founded a small craft brewery called Moonbear Brewing, which is located on the east coast of Korea near Sokcho. Back to Jacco.
All right, thank you. And now to Julia Mellor of the Sool Company. Julia.
Thank you, Jacco. Hi, everyone. My name is Julia Mellor, and I am a specialist in Korean traditional alcohol. I've also been in Korea a similar amount of time, around about 15 years, and I've spent 10 of those years studying, researching, and working to promote Korean traditional alcohol. So I founded my company, which is called the Sool Company, which is about promotions and information about Korean alcohol, but mostly to teach people about fermentation science, how to brew Korean alcohol, and also how to open breweries overseas. So back to you, Jacco.
Thanks. And last to Dan Hamilton of Diageo Korea.
Hi everyone, Dan Hamilton. For those of you that don't know Diageo, we're one of the global leaders in the spirits and beer sector. We have a collection of about 200 brands operating across 180 countries. I am a little bit the exception. I've only been in Korea for the last 6 months, but I've been operating across the Asia-Pacific region for most of the last 15 years, including stints in China, Japan, and Singapore.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. So got some general questions to kick us off, and then some industry-specific questions for each of you. Let's start off with, when you first came to Korea, what did you notice about the alcoholic beverage market, and how did you come to work in it? I would like to to kick that one to Ross first, because I think your first visit here to Korea was in the late 1980s. Did you have any drinks back then, or what did you notice about the market? How was it different from Australia?
You've got your dates wrong there a little bit, Jacco, but what I noticed was an absence of variety and an absence of range. There were a couple of local beers, there was cheap local whiskey, there weren't many spirits to access. Gin was not heard of in Korea. I guess there was probably a little bit of cheap vodka around, but soju was obviously the dominant drink. There was very little in the way of imported beers, both the Japanese beers and European and American beers. And I guess what got me interested in was the opportunity to help expand the range. And we did that with a sparkling grape called Bernini, which I think attracted a lot of interest just because it was different. It could be drunk in a sophisticated way, and it was a low alcohol offering.
Okay, thanks, Ross. Matt, to you, when you first came here, what did you notice about the drinks?
I think similar to Ross, it was limited choice, so not so great for consumers. I think in the international portfolios, we had a little bit of Miller Genuine Draft, some Budweiser, a little bit of Heineken. So in terms of choice, you were really limited to an American style pale lager or Heineken. What I also noticed was we were confined to a curfew when I first came to Korea. So we were, bars would have to shut at 11 or 12 p.m. at night, which would was similar to where we are now. I think we've come full circle, and now we're continuing to operate with curfews. So yeah, some things have changed, but some things have come back and remain the same.
Nice. Now, Julia, you're interested particularly in Korean traditional alcohol. Even that's changed over the years. How was it when you first arrived here?
Definitely big changes. I would say in the last 5 to 10 years, we've seen massive changes in the industry as a whole. But when I first got here, makgeolli was very much a cheap drink. It was mostly, almost entirely containing artificial sweeteners, the main culprit being aspartame. And to be honest, information and the way that people drank those alcohols was very different. So you had no upscale bars, no trendy places. Makgeolli was definitely an older person's drink. And soju, of course, always the dominant drink, even to today. But these days I do see daily changes, and it has very much skewed towards craft. It's gone towards handmade brews and also a younger generation. Traditionally, Korean alcohol has been an older generation brewery ownership, but now we have younger people that are wanting to buck the trend of a regular life and to try their hands at brewing traditional makgeolli. So it's a very dynamic industry at this point.
Dan, I know you're a fairly recent arrival here, but what are you noticing about the trends? Like, what are the spirits that are now selling much more than they were in previous years, according to the figures that you've got?
Yeah, no, look, we're seeing some really quite significant shifts in terms of the consumer trends. So particularly in the area of spirits, there's always been a very large whiskey market here, traditionally drunk in shared occasions. What we're seeing is people are going to drinking lighter drinks, they're drinking highballs, they're experimenting with cocktails, they're seeing a lot more personal choice come into it versus, the one serve which everyone is enjoying. And we're also seeing actually people going towards lighter drinks. So historically, a market which was more skewed towards higher alcohol content products into lower alcohol.
When you say lighter, I mean, are we talking from 40% down to 20%? How light is light?
There's a range of different ways that we see this manifest. So within whiskey, there's this really strong burgeoning low alcohol whiskey market. So it might be 32.5 to 35% versus typical whiskey, which would be 40% or above. But we're also seeing, particularly with international whiskey and brands like Johnny Walker, where people are drinking it as a highball, so as a long mixed drink. So in different ways, we're seeing that lower alcohol trend come through. And actually, I think we'll start to see a market emerge for non-alcoholic variants come through, which we're seeing in places like Australia and Europe.
Okay, let's talk about COVID-19. Generally speaking, how have Korean consumer drinking behaviors changed during the COVID pandemic, and how have the industry that you're involved in moved to overcome lost sales in one area? are there ways that you can compensate in other areas? Matt, do you want to start that one off first?
Yeah, sure. So we've seen big changes. There's been an over 80% increase in drinking at home and an over 40% increase in drinking alone, which is a new trend. And so the data is showing us that there's much more home consumption, much more consumption alone. And these are trends that are here to stay. We know that food delivery in Korea was big before COVID. It's going to be even bigger after. What we've done in response, there's another challenge at the moment as well. Our customers in bars and restaurants are really suffering, and we're trying to help them get through that period as best as we can. They need to transform their businesses to support food delivery sales. So we're helping them with our marketing agencies, our digital agencies, to make sure that they can embrace the opportunity fully. I'm quite proud that we've supported dozens of bars to help them survive during the COVID period by transforming the way they can digitalize or get more social with their business, all the way from using our marketing agencies to support them, to helping them with digital campaigns, all the way to taking food pairing menus so that they can be best presented when they're selling their products online.
Thanks. Ross?
I think the most prominent change is as Matt's alluded to, the switch from what you'd call the on-trade consumption of alcohol, bars, restaurants, pubs, to off-trade, which is hypermarts and convenience stores. Generally, it was traditionally roughly a 50-50 split by volume. It's probably about a 20-80 or 30-70 split now. And amazingly, CVS's, convenience stores, so CU, GS25, 7-Eleven, now sell pretty much 50% of the total consumption of beer in Korea. Now, the impact of that is that margins are much lower because the CVS's have huge buying power. They dictate prices and force you into 4 for 10,000 won promotions. And secondly, it's terrible for the very, very small breweries that don't have the ability to package in cans. So breweries that are reliant on the delivery of kegs to on-trade accounts have really suffered in the COVID scenario.
Thanks, Ross. Have you got anything to add there, either Dan or Julia, about the COVID pandemic?
No, I think the gentlemen have captured the trends well. In addition to the sort of at-home consumption growth that we see and more personal consumption at home, I think the other trend that we see is a really big rise in luxury. So super deluxe and above products, as people are more constrained in terms of entertainment out of home, as they're more constrained in terms of travel, we're seeing our luxury portfolio, Johnny Walker Blue and above, really performing well. And then a real shift towards entry-level standards. So we see younger legal drinking age plus drinkers coming into whiskey and spirits, and we see them very much coming into sort of standard price points. So sort of the K-shaped trends that we see across many markets is quite prevalent here post-COVID.
I would add to that a little bit, just on a cultural note as well, is previously it has always been seen as somewhat of a stigma to be drinking at home alone, and that has dramatically changed through COVID. We now have something called Home Sool or Home Sool, which is a recognized branding trend. Especially in the makgeolli industry, a lot of makgeolli breweries have now created home kits where they can make their own kimchi pancakes and have makgeolli delivered together. And as the gentleman was saying as well, in the convenience stores and things like that, there are a lot of pushes towards these trends. So it's no longer seen as a negative to be, enjoying a drink at home, which is definitely changing the game.
And that brings me, talking about drinking at home, that brings me to what are the laws around online sales and deliveries of alcoholic beverages? I know that there are different regulations for different kinds of drinks. So what are what's legal and semi-legal now? What can I do? Can I go online and order anything to be sent to my house? Let's see, Ross.
The basic rule is that you can't have alcohol delivered to your home, with an exception being alcohols. The eligibility to deliver alcohol packaged with food is still available. So if you pay $10 for some chicken, you can buy up to $10 of beer. A second element is that you can order alcohol to be delivered to convenience stores near your house, which expands the range of accessible alcohols proximate to home, but you still need to go and pick them up in person. and verify age. I think some other panelists might add to that comment.
So you said, Ross, that the exception is for Korean traditional alcohols. They can be ordered online and delivered to their home.
I believe so. Julia, perhaps.
Yeah, Julia, that sounds like good news for your industry.
It's actually, this was a pre-COVID trend actually, because it was about revitalizing the traditional industries. So yes, the rule is that if you are listed as a 전통주 or a traditional alcohol brewery, then you can access a B2C network on e-commerce platforms. So that has certainly changed the game for the very small producers. But it's also opened up windows for investigating ways that you can register your business as a 전통주 brewery or a traditional alcohol brewery in order to qualify for that. So yes, as for now, it is only traditional breweries.
Okay, Dan, I can imagine that Diageo is not too happy about that.
Look, we as a company, we are supportive of the positive shift towards an opening up of e-commerce for the sale of alcohol. We know that there is precedent across markets in the world where e-commerce can play a positive role in creating choice for consumers while still providing protections around ensuring there's no purchase from people not of legal drinking age or minimising risk around non-responsible drinking. So we think anything which is a positive step is the right thing, not only for the industry but for the consumer. The other opportunity at the moment is a thing called Smart Order, which allows consumers to go online to order a product and pick it up from their convenience store. And that is relatively early days, less than 12 months, but really exciting because it's giving consumers the opportunity to get into, things like selections of unique single malts you might not be able to buy on shelf, or a broader range of craft products, and then they can pick it up at their local convenience store. And for us, again, it's kind of the luxury, $150 plus price point where we're seeing really strong demand. So no, we think it's heading in the right direction, and we trust that we'll see more of a normalisation in the near future.
I want to jump off from Dan's earlier point that he made about seeking to discourage or at least to minimise the risk of alcohol being delivered to a home where somebody's underage and they've ordered it online with perhaps mum and dad's credit card, or irresponsible drinking. Let's talk about, have you seen any shifts towards or around responsible drinking? Are there any laws about that? Is it, for example, when you go into a bar here that the bartender has to stop serving you if he sees that you're visibly drunk? Ross?
I wouldn't say that there are any new laws in that regard necessarily, apart from the fact that there are some restrictions coming when in relation to advertising of alcohol. I believe shortly this year they're going to prevent cars from driving around being wrapped in branding around alcohol. What I would say though is that as a general consumer trend, particularly since the Kim Jong-nam law, which limited corporate entertainment to 30,000 won a head, you're seeing
that's the 2016 anti-bribery law for our listeners who may not be familiar. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's right. So the amount of hweshik, corporate entertainment that goes on after work is definitely reduced, and you're seeing more individual choice making on the part of consumers. And I think it's generally, particularly with the influx of wellness products, cause consumers to drink a little bit less and a little bit more selectively.
Matt, how is AE working towards promoting responsible drinking?
Firstly, yeah, we comply with, we fully support the national rules and industry commitments that we've made, not just in Korea, but around the world. It's really important. I think as our part of the organization, and it alludes to the point that Dan made around premiumization, we're happy if consumers drink less, but we prefer it if they drink better. So we're trying to bring in the right behaviors in place, the right education in place. But there's another important thing we can do, and we've made a commitment in our organization that 20% of our sales by 2030 will be non-alcohol product. And we're already on that track. In Korea, I'm currently at 8%. So I've got some work to do. We want to encourage responsible choices. We want to make sure that our non-alcohol brands and beers are available at bars. So if we have a driver in a group, they have an alternative to just beer. They have a refreshing premium beverage that they can choose. That's one of my key passions, I think, is to really get that responsible choice availability up and hit that 20% target within the next 3 years, not the next sort of 5 to 10.
When you say zero alcohol beverages, does that mean like an alcohol-free beer or an alcohol-free gin, which I learned recently is a real thing?
Yeah, alcohol-free beer, it's extremely big in Europe. The growth in non-alcohol beer is massive. It's a brewed product. It has less sugar. It's all natural ingredients. I won't say there are health benefits, but I will say that it is natural sugars, lower calories. It is a responsible choice and actually quite refreshing. We just need to improve the quality of those products. I know Diageo also has non-alcohol beer beverages, and in certain markets are doing very, very well. So it's really around providing that responsible choice for consumers in the off-premise. And in Korea, it was traditionally around females that are pregnant, perhaps, that are choosing those alcoholic beverages. We want to make it a cool choice for everyone to be able to reach for a non-alcohol beer in a bar or in a convenience store or anywhere and have a really good quality beer experience. And that's what we're trying to pursue.
Thanks. I'll segue to Dan there.
Yeah, no, the very similar trends that we see, and obviously with, I think we all have that circumstance where the choice is what to drink when you're not drinking. And this is where non-alcoholic variants can play a really positive role. In Europe in particular, we've launched recently 0.0 versions of the leading Tanqueray and Gordon's gin brands. You get all the flavour of a great gin and tonic, but without the alcohol. And we're looking actively at the timing for bringing those into the market in Korea. Some of these trends around people wanting more choice, people wanting lower alcohol variants or non-alcohol variants, they really are mega trends globally. We see it across markets, and it's a great opportunity to be able to give consumers the choice for those occasions.
Now, Julia, soju has quite a reputation for being cheap and nasty, that if you are an alcoholic, that is the way to go. How to reclaim that reputation? How does Korean traditional alcohol come back from that?
It's an image problem. We definitely have a lot of work to do with soju. Soju is still dominated mostly for one brand, but actually just to echo what everyone was saying before about the global trend for lower alcohol, this is also reflected in the soju industry. The ABV of soju continues to lower at the table strength. So actually, mostly these days it's around about 17%, whereas when I first came to Korea, it was 23%. And keeping in mind that soju is a distilled spirit, so it is very much a different product the more that you water it down. So the way we sort of see the future of soju in terms of the traditional techniques is that there actually are two categories of soju. There's table strength soju and there's spirit strength soju. And this is the unique thing about Korean drinking culture, is that soju is drunk in the volume and the style of a beer or a wine. It's usually paired with food. It's ubiquitous at every dinner table. But the traditional spirits are actually much higher in proof. They're much higher in spirit strength. So marketing the lower end as being, yes, of course, it might be a little bit lower in price point, and it is mass produced in a lot of the ways, but actually there's an entirely different category, which is craft distilled from fermentation, from grain to glass. And that's just simply down to education, promotions and education, that these two, there is a distinction between mass-produced soju and traditional soju.
Having just talked about responsible drinking, I think that's a good opportunity to move into what's a hot topic these days in business world is environment, social, and governance issues. So including sustainability and also transparency of sourcing and things. So how much of a concern or an issue is that in the industry? Is that a part of the larger discussion? Matt, to you first.
Yeah, definitely. It really goes back to our purpose as an organisation. ESG it's very topical at the moment, but I think for many of us, it's always been front and centre in the things that we do. I think in terms of consumer trends, Korean consumers are looking for sustainably sourced product, whether that be the raw materials that go into the beer or the environmental footprint we create in the supply chain. So it's front and center. I think I don't see it as an issue. I see it as a big opportunity in the way we think. We've got, there's a few things we've done as well. I think we were first in the market to move to all hybrid or electric cars. That was 6 years ago. So it's not because it's topical. It's something we believe is important. The other thing we've done is we've got an office that's rated at the highest level of environmental and engineering design. Again, done 7 years ago. So we treat the environment important. The well-being of our employees is really critical. And then also inclusiveness. 50% of our consumers are females. 50% of our team should be females, as far as I'm concerned. It's a basic, we want inclusiveness in Korea. And so, yeah, I see ESG as an opportunity. It's something we should all strive to improve, but also consumers are demanding it. And I think if we're not addressing ESG issues, we're going to come under more and more pressure. So I'd rather be on the front foot.
Who wants to follow on from that?
I think I would, I would just add that from our perspective, we've got, a collection of brands like Johnny Walker, which has just turned 200 years old. Guinness is more than 250 years old. So for us, sustainability is very much in our DNA. We're the custodians about making sure that those brands are strong for the next 200 years and beyond. And that means making sure we're making the right commitments about growing sustainably. So as a company, we're looking at reducing our water usage by 30%. All Johnny Walker will be made from recyclable or reusable packaging by 2030. And we're also making a significant investment in new tech, looking at things like paper bottles. So for Johnny Walker Black Label, now that sounds intuitively for a luxury brand, how do you do that? But actually the tech is coming through and the right partnerships to be able to bring these offerings into the market. We know that it's a massive opportunity for our consumers, so it's important that we meet those needs.
Thank you. Ross or Julie, do you have anything to add to that about ESG?
Two or three little points I'd make is that the growth of craft beer and obviously other types of alcohol, I think, is very good from an ESG perspective because of the local communities that the businesses tend to support. They create a meeting place, they create tourism, they contribute to the local economy. We do, little things. For example, our spent grains after the brewing process, we donate to farmers for livestock feed. We just give that away for free. We're looking at seeing if we can power the brewery by solar. We've got a number of initiatives that we hope to kick off in relation to the Korean Pandalgom, the Moonbear itself, which is a treasured animal. So I think that the small breweries and distilleries can really, from an ESG perspective, contribute a lot, particularly to the local communities.
Okay, and Julia, last?
Yeah, I think the Korean alcohol industry has a bit more of a challenge, simply because it's a challenge as a market in general. ESG is not as much on the radar. But two areas which we identify as a problem is the fact that makgeolli is still in plastic bottles. And this is a problem not just for the environment, but also for product respectability as a whole. It's generally considered a lower end product if it's served in a plastic bottle. But unfortunately, there are major glass shortages in Korea in terms of bottle designs and whatnot. So most of the craft breweries in Korean alcohol source their bottles from China for different opportunities for glass and design. So it is something that's more of a cost. It has to be put into their price point, and that's sets a lot of them back because as yet, good quality craft Korean alcohol is still a niche market, and they're still finding their footing in terms of that. But the one way that breweries also do incorporate in their own brewing process, just like Ross was saying with the lees, in Korean traditional techniques, our lees is called chigemi, and that chigemi, some breweries, one particular, actually incorporates that to make snacks. They can actually turn it into almost like a chip, you could say. So basically, they're finding ways to reuse those products in order to make it into something new.
I'm looking around for a plate of those chips right now. I could try some. Let's move on to talking a bit about the changing of the regulatory environment. I know that Korea, certainly in terms of the craft beer market, it was very hard to enter into that because of standards or rules around taxation, classification of beverages, and standardization. Ross, perhaps you could kick us off there. How has that changed over the last decade or so?
Very good question. Since 2014, there's been rapid deregulation of brewing licenses in Korea to enable the small craft breweries to commence operations. They eliminated a minimum tank size, which was a major barrier to entry. So tanks in the sense of both fermentation tank volume and bright tank volume. They've now allowed small craft breweries to distribute not just to on-trade venues, but to retail, which was previously prohibited. But the really big change that occurred was at the beginning of last year, when Korea moved from a value-based alcohol tax to a volume-based alcohol tax for beer. Now, the effect of that was that the advantages that were enjoyed by the imported beer, who were paying tax based on the landed cost of goods as opposed to the wholesale price, was eliminated. So that created a more equal playing field for local beer producers versus imported beer producers.
That does sound like some big shifts indeed. Matt, have you seen also regulatory changes or legal changes affect your side of the industry?
Yeah, the change in excise has had an impact on the business. So yeah, I think that has changed. There are regular changes in packaging requirements that keep us on our toes, but a lot of it is to protect consumers, and so we do our best to comply with those changes. But overall, I think the regulatory environment has enabled an explosion in innovation in Korean craft beer. And to me, I see that as a positive, not as a competitive issue.
Yeah.
If I see more Korean consumers switching up to drink premium, that can include our products as well. And so I'm supportive of the growth in innovation, supportive of the work that the craft industry is doing to give Korean consumers more choice, and they're demanding more choice. The craft industry is growing at an astonishing rate and will continue to grow. And so well done to Ross and the craft brewers for actually having a go and innovating and creating some great products.
Thanks. Dan, what's on your radar in terms of regulatory environment changes?
Look, I think the guys have captured it. This is a market where, you do need to understand the regulatory environment. You need to stay ahead of it. You need to make sure that you're complying with all of the appropriate laws, whether it's around packaging, whether it's around labels. So for anyone who is, looking at the market, looking at opportunities, I just suggest, do your homework, make sure you get the right advice and the right guidance to be able to step through it appropriately.
Now, Julia, your industry is in a little bit of a unique position in that the regulatory environment is not there just to regulate, but the laws are also there to promote the brewing and consumption of Korean traditional alcohol. So could you tell us a bit about how that's impacted?
That's right. Actually, the changes in the beer regulatory market has then prompted the taxation department to then change the rules for Korean alcohol as well. So there are two main changes that are a part of this. And the first is that a new law came in a couple of years ago now called the House Monthly Law. And basically what that does is allow brewers in the cities, in Seoul, for example, to start their own microbrewery as in a brew pub. Now, the regulatory problems on that is that they cannot sell outside of their location, and they must already have a restaurant license. But it's set to promote this idea of producing craft on a small scale within the restaurant industry. But in terms of actually owning a brewery, it's intrinsically tied to agriculture, as most alcohol industries and taxation is. So there is a very significant tax break if you use rice from the local area that your brewery is produced. So this is case in point why we don't see a lot of breweries in Seoul, because there's not a lot of rice paddies in Seoul. But I will say that it's prohibited, because I mentioned this younger generation that's coming up that doesn't want to live in the countryside just to open a microbrewery. What they want is to bring their brews to their customers. So they're opting not to have a Chontonju license, a Korean traditional alcohol license. They're opting for a microbrewery license. Now that does prohibit them from selling alcohol online from B2C, which is a big cut. But it does mean that they've got storefronts, they've got access, and they are trying to revitalize this industry as being young and cool.
That's very interesting. I hadn't anticipated that. Now, Ross earlier mentioned the Kim Yong-nan, or the 2016 anti-bribery law, and some of the effects that's had on the alcoholic beverage industry. Perhaps there's a bit more that we can explore on that there, because it certainly had quite a large impact, specifically on limiting how much companies can spend, or even how much individuals can spend on treating, for example, government officials to to meals with alcohol. So does anyone want to kick off a quick discussion on what are some of the wider impacts of the 2016 anti-bribery law on the alcoholic beverage industry?
I'll jump in really quickly on that because actually I know quite a few of my Korean traditional alcohol restaurant partners that had to close simply because they were popular destinations for expensive dinners and expensive experiences that they could no longer be put on the company card because it exceeded the amount of money throughout that time. So it does have a ripple effect into the restaurant industry and to the bar industry, separate to gifts and things like that, because the King law also meant for how much money you can spend on a peshik or a company dinner. So it did have quite a severe impact into the higher end Korean alcohol restaurants that were common destinations for business meetings and business dinners.
Thanks. Who wants to respond to that?
I'd say on the flip side, though, there's less forced outings, less forced sculling of cheap soju. And I think there's a greater individualism amongst consumers now. And craft beer is a good example where, as Matt said before, the consumers are wanting to drink a little bit less, a little bit better. They're more experimental. And actually, it's very female-led. So the 12% imperial stouts are being drunk by women, not so much by men, and then men follow. So I think that is an effect of the less forced peshik culture that has come about, because women are now allowed to go out and make their own decisions, and they're doing so in a more adventurous way than men.
Okay. Matt, anything to add to that?
No, not really. I think it impacted premium, super premium more than it affected international restaurants and bars where we are strong. It would have had some impact. A very famous Korean company put in the rule, the 911 rule, 9 p.m., one venue, one type of alcohol. And so you could not put anything else on your company credit card. And so, yes, it would have had some impact, but we saw the growth of the overall industry offsetting that impact. And so, yeah, some impact, but not so much in beer.
Okay. Question for you, Dan. The Korean market for spirits, how does that differ, or how is that similar to other markets in Northeast Asia?
Yeah, no, good question, Jacco. So, and I previously ran our business in Japan, so I have some good sort of reference points to the market there. I think when we look at the way Korea has evolved, actually some of the trends away from people going out less in that sort of business occasion, less high consumption of alcohol, more into personal choice, more casual, more modern Western bars, and very consistent trends that we've seen play through. Japan is a country which has really seen the explosion of the highball serve, particularly as a whiskey serve, whiskey and soda. We're seeing highballs really come onto trend in Korea, and that's a trend across kind of Japanese whiskey as well as international brands. Quite exciting because we think it's a way of really sort of, recruiting the next generation into whiskey. Obviously, next generation being legal drinking age plus. And the other thing that's been really exciting to see over the last decade has been the kind of rise of Japanese whiskey. Whiskey first came to Japan in about 1920. A gentleman, Mr. Takatsuru, was the father. He travelled to Scotland. He learned the art of how to make whiskey from the best Scotch whiskey distillers and blenders, and brought that back into Japan. And then it created quite a big, significant domestic industry, but one that really wasn't recognised outside of the borders of Japan. And that's seen, kind of with the growth of Japanese whiskey, we've seen more craft distilleries being opened. We've seen that entrepreneurial side come through. And I think there's potential for that here in Korea as well.
Quick follow-up, Dan. Are there any whiskies or other alcohols made specifically for the Korean market?
Well, we actually have a brand here, which is our largest whiskey brand in Korea, which is called Windsor. It's a beautiful blended Scotch whiskey, where Lochnagar is the key distillery. But we actually blend that specifically for Korea. It's got a liquid profile which really meets the local palate. It's a very smooth, very balanced whiskey. And we're using that brand to also then innovate into these lower alcohol trends that we've spoken about. So we've launched a honey variant at 32.5% alcohol, so that's the lowest alcohol whiskey available at the moment, and a new 19-year variant. So yeah, we really look at the consumer here in Korea. We look at the local requirements and make sure that we've got the liquids to meet that.
Matt, do you want to add anything to that about differences between Korea and other Northeast Asian markets?
Well, I'm not a Japan expert, but I happen to know a few working for Asahi. So before the call, I did have a talk with the head of marketing. And yeah, to what Dan said, beer is in a decline in Japan and seems to be continuing to do so. The RTD, which is ready to drink, the highball, is in growth, is in massive growth, to the point where if you go into a convenience store, there will be one fridge. I'm just paraphrasing what my marketing person told me. There'll be one fridge with beer and one fridge with ready to drink variants, including highballs and others. So I think sometimes we see trends in Japan as an indicator of trends that form in Korea. So it's something we can look at. And as Dan said, there is RTDs are growing. RTDs are still quite small in Korea. And maybe there's opportunity for growth from Australian brands, from other listeners that are on our session today. But I see that as a big opportunity over the next five years. Other than that, I think the trends are quite similar. One thing I am seeing though is a lot of innovation from COVID in Japan. There's a lot more at home, occasions, and technology quickly being developed to create a very nice premium at-home experience. A couple of the things I saw today were really very compact at-home draft machine units that are very easy to install, very easy to use, and you don't need to go through very large keg sizes to have a nice draft experience at home. So that was one interesting thing that I'll be looking at and maybe exploring for Korea. The other one is a can with a fully opening top. So it feels like you're drinking draft, but the whole top of the can opens up. So there's really interesting innovations coming out of Japan in our research center that I think we should look at as in terms of, how can we improve the consumer experience? But I think the main one is RTDs, as Dan said, but then also a lot of innovation coming out of Japan at the moment that we may see in Korea soon.
One for Ross and Julia. Are there any particular characteristics of Korean culture that should be borne in mind in either making or selling or serving of alcohol?
In terms of Korean culture, I think one thing that really has to be understood fundamentally about selling alcohol in Korea is that it's usually done with food. The cultural way of drinking alcohol is not to stand around at a bar and drink and mingle with other people. It's you go out with people that you know. And when you are seated at a bar, generally you have side dishes and you have food that goes with that. So there's a lot of implications in terms of price point, in terms of pairing, in terms of the experience that you're offering in that way. And actually, I do think that is becoming a bit more popular overseas into Western markets as well, is to serve alcohol with food. So I would say that's one consideration to absolutely consider.
Ross?
I agree with that. I think you'll see a lot more food pairing and experimentation, craft beer and also with the distilled liquors. I think craft is intriguing to Korean customers because there's a story and often there's a brewery tour involved. So the use of local ingredients, and again, this is probably more relevant to distilled liquors using various berries and herbs that are found naturally in Korea, I think can add a story and a significance to local distillation. But look, certainly even in the beer industry, we're seeing some local hop growing, some local malt growing. So I think nationalism around alcohol is growing generally.
One question we had sent in from an audience member that it would be remiss of me not to ask today, although we do have 4 industry experts, we do not have anyone from the wine industry represented here. And Australia, of course, has a big wine industry. What is the perception of Australian wines in the Korean market? And Ross, since you started with your liquor import business by importing a South African wine. I'd like you to kick off on that.
Yeah, sure. So it's a really good question. The country that made the initial volume hit here was Chile, because they had the first FTA.
2004, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, something like that. And they hit the markets with pretty cheap liquid. There was a period just before the GFC in 2008 when champagne was incredibly popular. Moe in particular was on fire, and then prior to that time too, there were a lot of exclusive wine bars. After the GFC, people started drinking cheap. They didn't stop drinking, but they just drank cheaper liquids. So imported beer started its rise to prominence, and the wine market fell away a bit. I'd say overall, there's been a resurgence of wine. I think there's probably a belief that French wine is the prince of wines. Australian wine is not regarded poorly at all, but we don't see enough of it here. And I think partly that's explained by the huge market that existed until recently in China, and some of the wines that were being made specifically for that market. Whereas Korea, it's a very scattered market when you look at all the small importers. Unless you're a very large multinational with huge distribution, it's hard to make an impact here. The FTA with Australia definitely helped a little bit, and I think we'll see further opportunities for Australia wine, particularly in the wake of the China issues.
Does anyone have any comments to add to that about wines, and specifically Australian wines, if possible?
I think Ross has captured it well. I think the other opportunity for Australian alcohol producers are actually Australian whiskey. You know, it's starting to get recognition across the Asia Pacific region. There's some great products that are coming out, terrific liquids, and quite relevant. So I think it's not just a wine opportunity from Australia, but it's also into whiskey and spirits.
Okay, I believe that Rowan has a question from the audience here.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I'm going to start off with a question for myself. And you know, over the 7 years I've been living in Korea, I have seen some Australian beverage players come into the market and also leave, be that from Coopers and VB. And maybe this is a good question for Matt, but what are some of the challenges you've seen for Australian beer manufacturers in the Korean market, and you know, why have they been hesitant to either stay in the market or enter the market?
It's a good question. I think Australian brands, we imported VB a few years ago, and then it transitioned to another company, but now it's ours again after the acquisition of CUB. It will be small, it will be niche, and it's very difficult to create big beer brands in Korea and maintain it. It costs a lot of money to invest and to create brands. So there's a big market of Koreans that have studied in Australia or done business in Australia that have that love for Australian brands and want that nostalgia feel of a VB. But to grow that to anything of scale would be very, very difficult in the Korean market, particularly now with the growth of domestic craft. So, you know, it's something to consider, but also I think it's important to have your ambitions quite clear in terms of what scale you want to get to. But also finding the right distributor for your brands is important. I know AustCham on the board, there are distributors that are very good with beer, Australian and South African wine, and I know others that are joining the call are very good distributors. I think the key is to find the right distributor, keep your expectations in check, but understand and be patient that it does take time to build brands in the Korean market, and there's some very, very heavy competition. So yeah, it's a very challenging one for Australian brands, particularly in beer. Will we bring some Australian beer back? If we get enough requests, just like the fillet of fish at McDonald's, maybe we can bring back the VB.
Right. You just mentioned distribution. We had a question sent in from an audience member before the webinar. How does distribution of alcoholic beverages work in Korea? How does a product go from a factory or an import warehouse to the shops or to the consumers? I know that's very different across all of your different industries and companies. So Ross, do you want to kick off with what does that mean? How does distribution work for craft beers?
Well, if you're talking for imported beer or locally produced, because they're quite.
So craft beer produced locally here in Korea, sorry.
Okay, generally the Korean market is such that even if you have an end account with which you have a strong relationship, being a bar or a restaurant, they will still purchase the alcohol through a wholesaler. So the typical approach, and it's not that different with imported either, is that you will outsource your logistics being storage and trucking to wholesalers, and then wholesalers will truck the product to the end account. So while you might be establishing very good visibility with your brand in an account and dealing directly with them, they will always nominate for convenience a wholesaler with whom you end up contracting. So that's good for the producer because your account is just the wholesaler, and the wholesalers take roughly 15 to 20%, and then they do all the collections of the various invoicing that goes to the end customers. So producer, wholesaler, end customer, third-party logistics company.
And can I get down to the other end of the spectrum there, imported liquors, how does that get distributed in Korea?
Yeah, so the wholesale segment is very fragmented. So we sell to about 1,500 wholesalers nationally. And, obviously there is a smaller universe within that are disproportionately significant. But it does mean that as you're looking at your growth ambition, you need to be aware about the organisational resource and requirements to be able to service that size of wholesale network in terms of building relationships, customer service, and logistics. And that sort of, I think it speaks to the point that Matt was saying earlier about being clear on what's your scale, what's your target universe, which outlets do you want to sell in, and then looking at which is the wholesalers you need to operate through to be able to service that.
And then very quickly, Julia, distribution of Korean traditional alcohol.
Yes, it's quite similar on this end as well. It's even smaller, it's even more niche. So actually a lot of the small producers, they still use postal delivery, and they often deliver themselves if it's within their sphere of capability to do so. Some of the larger producers, they do have distributors, especially in the city. There are dedicated distributors of alcohol, but there's not many of them. Simply because it's such a small market with the portfolio of products and whatnot. So if you're not a large company like the much larger brands, then it's very difficult to get into that distributor's portfolio. So you do end up finding out your own resources. But of course, Korean alcohol has to be refrigerated if it's of good quality. So it does present some logistical challenges that usually delivery by postal service works better.
I believe Rowan's got another question here.
Yeah, I've just got a question here from the audience. They're interested in the panel's views about the key inputs into Korean beer production, such as malt and barley, and what drives the purchasing decisions into these inputs, and how do Australian inputs compare in terms of price, quality, accessibility to other suppliers?
So you're talking about your malt and your hops and grains and whatever?
Yes. Anyone have any ideas, Matt, possibly, or even
but I think
craft brewer?
Ross is a brewer in Korea. I can start. I think now it's really important. Sustainability of your raw materials is critical, and so maintaining a sustainable supply of your hops and malt, whether that be Australia or Europe or wherever it's grown, is high priority. Consumers want that as well. We've seen one large brand appear out of nowhere, Terra, in Korea, with a Australian malt claim.
From the Golden Triangle.
Australian malt, but they've created a marketing campaign around that it is clean, green, Australian malt, to support their premiumized position of their brand. So, and they've done exceptionally well. So Australian raw materials are seen as a competitive advantage in the brewing industry in Korea. And I think, yeah, if you're a grower in Australia, Australia's image as a clean and green source of raw materials will continue. I think the embassy and AustCham and the team do a very good job to make sure that our brands are well positioned. So yeah, I think there's opportunity, and I think at a large scale, the large brewers are already using Australian grains and malt to premiumize their product. Ross, is there anything you want to add?
I'd say probably in relation to hops, America probably has a dominant position, particularly Oregon hops. Malt is more competitive. We use quite a bit of malt from Belgium. There's that European malts, Australian malts are all assessed, and I think ultimately certainty of supply and price are probably the most important factors. You can get a tax deduction in Korea by applying for a malt quota, and one thing we need to look at a bit more is accessing Australian malt again, which has been caused to suffer a decline due to the Chinese situation. So hopefully we see some more Australian malt in the market here.
I've been informed that we've got time for one more question, so I'll make it a quick one, but one for all of you. What's a trend or a shift to keep an eye on in the next year or so in the Korean alcoholic beverage market? Julia, to you first.
I think Korean, for the traditional perspective, we're going to see a continuation of small batch creative ingredient based makgeollis. So there has been this pop up of makgeollis that are going beyond what you might consider makgeolli to be. They might be infused with various different flavors and whatnot, but they have different approaches in terms of labeling, in terms of design, and in terms of marketing. But I'd say the major change is definitely in the consumer trends, in how people are consuming makgeolli and consuming soju. We are seeing it get younger, which is great. But we are seeing it also becoming something that, as I think you mentioned before, Jacco, or somebody else mentioned, that it's a national pride. Koreans are finding pride again in their own alcohol industry.
Thanks. Dan?
I think continuing strength in luxury, I think that's going to be a very enduring theme the next 12 months, and the rise of single malts. Historically, much more blended whiskey market, and consumers shifting into more peaty and smokier malts, more complex flavours.
Dan, just a quick yes or no. Have gin and rum crazes arrived in Korea?
Gin is definitely starting. It's taking off. It's off a small base, but gin and tonic as a serve and gin as a category is definitely, we're seeing quite a strong uptick there. Rum, it's a little bit more nascent. It's very much more a whiskey market in terms of dark spirits, but no, gin is one to watch. And
I'll say that there's also 2 new gin distilleries locally produced here in Korea. So you are seeing a lot more locally produced of these spirits, and gin will be a lot more common.
Okay, thanks. Ross, a shift or a trend to watch in the next year?
Seltzers. Hard seltzers.
Seltzers, did you say?
Yeah, seltzers. Hard seltzers.
Okay.
Grow in popularity, I think.
And Matt?
Well, I hope there's a massive shift in our restaurant and bar customer performance, and hopefully more of them can survive. I'm predicting a big turnaround in the second half. We already saw it in the south when restrictions were eased. We were exceeding last year's sales levels. So I'm just hopeful that we can continue to support our customers and our business partners as we go. But I'm really confident of a second half resurgence and a return to restaurants and bars. And linked to what Dan was also saying, I think this fine dining trend, eating well trend and drinking well trend is going to continue. So hopefully a big return to restaurants and bars, and when they do, it'll be premium brands, including ours.
That's great. Well, that's a good way to wrap up our conversation. I'd like to give a big thanks to Julia, to Dan, to Matt, and to Ross for joining us today here. And to Rowan, you're going to finish off the...
Yeah, once again, I would like to thank all our panelists today. Obviously, we had Matthew Holmes from AU Brands Korea, Ross Gregory from Moonbear and Indulge Co, Julia Mellor from the Sool Company, and Dan Hamilton from Diageo Korea. And our illustrious MC, thank you very much, Jacco, for joining me on today's session. I do apologise, we did have some audio technical difficulties, which we were trying to sort out, and I'm sure we'll get all organised for next event. Also, lastly, just want to thank the Grand Hyatt for their assistance in allowing us to film this session at their illustrious Paris bar.
Yeah.
And I look forward to hosting a physical event here once COVID does subside a little bit. So thank you very much for attending. If you do have any further questions, be sure to send them through to us and we'll try to chase them up. And I look forward to doing another event just like this shortly. Thank you very much, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.